Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Northampton Community College 2020 Virtual Peace and Social Justice Conference. We're having a great day so far, and today's session is going to be focused on immigration and asylum seeking in contemporary United States with Molly Mart. So I'm going to hand off the mic to Nate Carpenter, who is going to be moderating the session, and he can introduce Molly, and then we will be off and running. Take it away, Nate.
Great, thanks very much, Ken. And thanks everybody for showing up. It looks like we have a really great turnout today. Looks like we have 47 people, 48, 49, 50 people joining us today. So that's really fantastic. And it's great because I'm really thrilled about today's session, which is salient and has significance for all of us locally, nationally, and internationally. I'm really pleased today to introduce to you Molly Mart, who is an immigration attorney here in the Lehigh Valley. She is coming to us with expertise in family immigration law and also sports law as well. She earned her Juris Doctorate from Villanova University with an emphasis on intellectual property. And she's served, in addition to her work in immigration law, has served as secretary for the Villanova Law Sports Law Association. She's also interned with Samsung Telecommunications of America, Western Digital, and has also clerked for Rainmaker Sports and Entertainment Group. So that's part of her sports law expertise. She's going to be speaking to us today about immigration law, and about her both professional and personal experience with immigration law here in the United States and in the Valley. In addition to her legal work, Attorney Mart volunteers with Gift of Life organization, and also volunteers with underprivileged communities in the Dominican Republic. She's a member of the American Immigration Lawyers Association, the Northampton County Bar Association, and the Pennsylvania Bar Association. Attorney Mart is going to speak for roughly 20 minutes or so, and then we will open up to conversation, both questions from the audience, and but I believe there's also questions, discussion questions, Molly, that you'll be posing to the audience as well. So with that, a very warm welcome. Before we start, questions can be dropped right into the chat box, so you can type those questions in at any time during the talk. I'll be moderating, and we will open it up for discussion at the end. Please keep your mics muted, and let's give a warm welcome to Molly Mart.
Thank you. Appreciate you having me today. I'm looking forward to speaking to all of you about a topic that seems like it's in the news every single day lately. I have to say my experience in immigration law is quite a roller coaster. Sometimes you start a case and it will change 5 times before it is completed. There's our rulings every single week. It is tough to know where you stand, so we have to stay up on current events because sometimes forms are being implemented one day and the next they're not. So it is definitely something to keep on top of. I'll start by talking about just a few of the different governmental organizations that we work with, are parts of the government. So immigration has many different facets. We work with the Department of Homeland Security. United States Citizenship and Immigration Services fall underneath the Department of Homeland Security, as does Customs and Border Protection and ICE. Then we also work with the Department of State. They handle anything consular, so anyone coming in through a consulate, coming into the United States on any form of visa, that will be handled by the Department of State. And then we do also work with the Department of Justice. When someone is in immigration court, that falls under the Department of Justice. So it's difficult enough navigating immigration, but it can be made even more difficult when sometimes these different governmental entities have to work together, and they do not always work together so well. So start off with that. I know something that's particularly important to college students because some of you may be DACA holders, and this is something that has been in the news lately. In June, there was a big court case that was decided, and it opened up the floodgates for DACA, essentially. We thought we were going to be able to prepare initial DACA requests for people who have never been able to request it before, and that lasted just over a month. On July 28th, the Department of Homeland Security released a memo stating that they would no longer be accepting, they will not accept any new DACA requests. Any that were sent in the interim period would be returned, anyone's payments would be returned. Advanced parole, which is the ability to leave the United States when you don't have status. You can leave the United States and come back in and retain your previous status. That was also taken away. They're no longer granting that, denying any application that came in that interim period. And though that Supreme Court case actually was supposed to expand DACA for the United States, they decided that they were going to now limit all DACA renewals to just 1 year. So it was frustrating. It was something that gave all of us hope. I'm sure a lot of people who were thinking of applying for DACA gave them hope, and it really ended up being something more difficult. Not only were those who had not yet applied stuck in their same status as before, which was no status, but those who previously held DACA now were limited to 1 year. So they're spending more money every single year and time to reapply for DACA. Something that's important, I don't think a lot of people realize, is immigration is extremely expensive. Attorney's fees aside, government filing fees for any one case can range anywhere from $500 to $2,000 potentially. And that is something that really can price out some people who just, they have the ability to obtain status, but they are priced out by the cost of immigration and the government filing fees. So for immigrants, I saw a question regarding what having DACA means for immigrants. This is something that allows those who came in when they were young, were here prior to 2007. It allows them to live in the United States. They are protected from deportation so long as they don't commit any certain types of crimes and they maintain their status. And they get work authorization. So they get a social security number. They have the ability to obtain jobs just as you or I would. It's something that gives them the ability to live in the United States and feel a little bit more like we do here, the ability to work, actually not under the table, to pay taxes and feel as if they're contributing to their families. But it really is something that for so many of them, if they did not enter on a visa, they're stuck in DACA status. So if DACA is completely taken away, they will just revert to being undocumented. And there are people that say they don't have a United States citizen spouse. They have nowhere to go. And if they didn't enter on a visa, they have nowhere to go. They were just stuck in DACA status. Yes, they are protected for a time from deportation. They have the ability to work legally, but it does not really afford them any hope at a future. And it's something that's very temporary and possibly could be taken away at any moment. So it's very frustrating for many DACA holders because it's sort of like you have the ability to live here, you have the ability to work, but nothing else, and you may lose that in a year or two. Going off of that, another similar thing to DACA is temporary protective status. So that's a congressionally created program that grants a work permit and reprieve from deportation to people who their countries have experienced natural disasters, warfare, or any other extreme sort of event. And it is, as its name says, it's temporary. A lot of the countries, they have been extended, but unfortunately back on the 14th of September, there was a case, Ramos v. Wolf, in the Ninth Circuit that they said that the Trump administration has the ability to end temporary protective status for 4 countries. So for Nepal, Nicaragua, Sudan, and El Salvador. That is hundreds of thousands of people currently living in the United States, many who have been here for many, many years. They have children, they have spouses, they have parents here, that once TPS ends, they will just be here in limbo, once again, undocumented. So there may be people who have been here working for 10 years, having TPS, and working for their current employer. They're going to lose their job because they will no longer have work authorization. And that's something that's very serious. Some of them that are here and they have professional licenses, they will lose their professional license. So it's something that is definitely affecting many people. And it's frustrating because you're here, you have status, but in our current political climate, something like that can just be taken away. And unfortunately, in the past few years, there's been a record of this happening constantly. It's one week after another, cases that are just seeing those who have lived here's rights being taken away, their ability to work, their ability to support their families and live without fear of being put into immigration proceedings and deported ultimately. There was also another current case that limited the ability of TPS holders to adjust status. So this was just recently decided in about the past month and a half. Previously, those who held TPS could leave the United States on what I previously mentioned is called advanced parole. So it's a document they have to obtain, say that they have a sick family member or haven't seen their grandmother since they were 3 years old and they need to leave the United States for some reason or a funeral. They can leave and they have permission to come back in. They're not guaranteed they'll come back in, but previously you generally will be let back in absent any crimes or anything large that happened while you were gone. And after they were let back in, if they had a spouse that was a United States citizen, they could adjust status, and that's also been taken away. So not only is the current government taking away status for many people in the future, they've also been working on taking away the ability of people to actually become residents and have a future in the United States. And that's very frustrating for people. I have clients who have been in the United States longer than I've been alive, which is crazy to hear, and they are undocumented and they could be at risk of being deported any day to a country that they don't know. They don't have any family members in, they don't have any friends in. The United States is really the only country that they've come to know. They've lived here 30 some years. And unfortunately, that is the climate we're in, where the United States is willing to send people like that back to their home countries. So I know that I said as well I would discuss that immigration is becoming more time consuming, more expensive. I'll get to the questions as well. I see them popping up on the side. I'll get to that as soon as I'm done speaking. And really, that's been the theme over the past year or two. So in February, we had February 24th, the public charge rule was implemented. So essentially, to become a permanent resident of the United States, you now have to fit into a set of criteria. And they're looking at 7 items. They're looking at age, health, family size, financial health, education and skills, your immigration status, which your immigration status is how long are you staying in the United States. And then there's something called the affidavit of support, which I'll explain each one of them separately. So age, if you are younger than 18 or older than 65, that is a mark against you when becoming a permanent resident under this new public charge examination. Your health, so any applicants that have health issues that would prevent them from either studying or holding a job, that's also makes becoming a resident more difficult now. Your family size, if you have a very large family and you don't have a very large income, that is a mark against you. It becomes more difficult to become a resident because they say, how can you support all of these people in your family in addition to one more, which is you? Financial health, anyone with bad credit, a lot of debt, not a lot of savings, and potentially low income. That's also makes it more difficult to become a resident. Education and skills. So someone who does not speak English, that now is something that they are making it more difficult to become a resident. Someone who does not have a high school education or a job history, that's also making it more difficult. And then if you've accepted any sort of public benefit, they have a particular list of public benefits, but it encompasses many things. SNAP, TAMP, there are many things that families may have needed and they're here and they didn't have resources. And if you've accepted them, that is a mark against you essentially when applying to become a permanent resident. And then the immigration status, the amount of time you'll be spending in the United States. So you're becoming a resident, you're planning to live here for the rest of your life. So they're looking at you a little bit with more of a stringent assessment because you're going to be living here for your whole life. And then the affidavit of support is a form that the person that is sponsoring you or petitioning for you to become a resident, so a family member, has to file for you showing that they make a certain amount of money or they have a certain amount of assets. And that goes by family size to show that they can support you in addition to their family. You can apply for, you can have a second affidavit of support. It's called a joint sponsor. So someone else in addition to your family member, say your family member doesn't work, you were the breadwinner. They can have someone else help, but now under this new public charge rule, if that person is not a household member or in some way related to you, they look at that differently and a little bit more, they give you more difficulty becoming a resident. So really, it's become somewhat elitist to become a permanent resident these days. This new public charge rule, the United States is somewhat weeding out those who are uneducated, those who have health conditions, anyone who's unable to work, and even say someone wants to have their spouse come to the United States who's not going to contribute monetarily to the family, but they're going to be a homemaker. They're going to contribute in the home and care for the children or care for the home or contribute in other ways. That's looked upon poorly that as a resident. I mean, we're really examining what can the person earn monetarily in the United States. And I think that's something that's important for all of us to think about. Is that the type of country we want to be? You only have value to us if you can earn money. Obviously, I'm sure all of you agree, there are so many other ways to bring value to a country other than monetarily. So it's definitely a concerning trend in immigration right now. Another way that it's become more time consuming and expensive is just on October 2nd, fees were raised. So fees for many of the applications with USCIS, that's applying when you're in the United States and you are applying, or some people are out of the United States, part of their application happens here. They raised some of those fees by $500 each, or some of the applications, they used to bundle fees, they've unbundled them. So an application to be a resident may now cost $1,000 more than it did a month ago, which also prices people out. Citizenship, the cost to apply for naturalization to become a citizen, that rose by over $500. So essentially, it's been compared to sort of a poll tax. It's pricing people out because becoming a citizen gives you the right to vote. And now so many people who are low income cannot afford that. They can't pay over $1,000 to apply to be a citizen. So that is obviously making it expensive in that way. All of these come with new forms. The public charge rule, they implemented a new 18-page form for USCIS. And when someone is consular processing, coming in from outside of the United States through a consulate, they implemented a new form called the DS 5540. So it's more time consuming to fill those forms out. And if someone is hiring an attorney to help them navigate this, it's become more expensive because unfortunately we have to spend 5 or 6 hours more preparing this new form. And it's not just a form, it is a whole slew of evidence. Anything you provide them, you need to back up. You say you have a high school diploma, you need to produce it. You say you have $5,000 in your bank account, you need to produce proof of that. They want to see your credit score. They want to see any proof of loans you may have, any sort of job history. They might want to see a letter from your employer. It's every single thing that they add on as a requirement takes time. So it is definitely something that has made the process more difficult for so many people. And it's also almost made it impossible for people to do it on their own. We've seen so many more people who have attempted to begin to prepare their documents or apply to be a resident or for any other form of relief and came to us and said, I can't do it on my own anymore. There are just too many requirements, which is unfortunate. Obviously, I'll always recommend, you should have help. You should understand the law before you apply for anything, but we shouldn't have everything based upon the fact of being able to pay for an attorney, because some people just cannot. All of these forms are publicly available on the government websites. You can access them without an attorney, but they've become so complicated and required so many forms of documentation. They've become very picky, and the forms of checks they accept, when they require certain fees, when they don't. It's become very difficult to navigate if you don't do this every single day. So that's definitely frustrating, because I think that limits access for people to immigration. And lastly, I'll just go into it. They've been very focused lately on marriage fraud. So our country has a very linear view of what marriage is as far as the government and immigration. And if your marriage does not fit into that box, if you do not have the proof that the government wants, they will conclude that you have a fraudulent marriage. And that is something that is very difficult to overcome. If you have a ruling, say that you were 20 years old, you were married, you applied for your spouse, or your spouse petitioned for you, and it was determined your marriage was fraudulent. And then 20 years later, you're now 40, your parent may be a U.S. citizen now and want to sponsor you. If you have a ruling of marriage fraud in your immigration history, you can never obtain any immigration benefit in the future. So even if your marriage happened 25, 30 years ago, if there is that ruling of marriage fraud, your parent can't sponsor you now. Even if you've left the country and you've lived out of the country for 20, 30 years, that's something that is a permanent bar. So it's something that's very important. They're being more stringent on things. They're requiring more things, making these rulings very somewhat hastily, and it affects a lot of people's futures. I will turn it over for questions now. I see a few here, and I want to make sure I get to all of them. So I did cover the DACA question. I see a question that says, are people allowed to reapply after being deported from the United States? You are, but after being deported, there's called what it is the permanent bar. So you have to stay outside the United States for at least 10 years prior to applying for any sort of benefit. And if you come back before those 10 years, you will have a permanent bar, so you can never come back, essentially. They will just redeport you. If you have a deportation and you come back into the United States and you are caught by immigration, you will be deported once again, unfortunately. I see, how do we calculate the value of a community member? Oh, this was Nate, sorry. How do we calculate, I guess I'll open it to you. How do we calculate the value of a community member? What does it mean to contribute? And feel free to unmute yourself to answer at this point, if anyone. Do any of you feel it's right to judge people by their earning potential, whether they should be able to live in the United States or not?
Definitely not.
Yeah, it's frustrating, it's something that they're basing it upon your ability to earn. They're trying to keep out people who do not have a large amount of income, and it's very frustrating because many people are here, their family members are here. Immigration really was for so long about reuniting families and giving people educational opportunities, giving them job opportunities, and it's become very different than that in this day and age.
I find it interesting that they would do that, though, because the jobs that the immigrants want to do are like people who don't have the income that they're not allowing to come over here are doing the jobs that a lot of us don't want to do for that amount of money anyway. So I don't understand why it would matter that their income is low. They're not coming to take your job in the government. They want a job that most Americans think they're above doing anyway.
Yes. No.
And also I would like to add to it that the minimum wage doesn't allow anybody to earn enough money to live. So how are they supposed to do it on most jobs?
Yes, Exactly. And it's actually the requirement for the affidavit of support. So the requirement that you have to show to sponsor a family member that you can support them is 125% of the poverty level. So these people are not below the federal poverty level. You have to be at 125% of the federal poverty level for that year. So it's somewhat of a high bar. Okay, I see that. How do you think that these increased restrictions, prices, documentation for immigration, oh, I'm sorry, it is skipping down, could impact the amount of undocumented immigrants in the United States? I think that the fact is that people who are already here, who are undocumented, who may have a path to residency through a family member, may not be applying now. They just don't have the ability to, and it's frustrating because it can provide a better future for so many people. I mean, I think one notion that I'd like to dispel too, just undocumented does not mean that those people are not contributing to society. Many of our clients who are undocumented have what's called an ITIN number. So it's a number, it's a unique identifier with the IRS. You can still file and pay taxes, and many, many undocumented immigrants are paying taxes, which is big. They're not reaping the benefits, but they're paying it. And many of these people, though they have a path to residency and someday citizenship, they don't have the means to pay for that. So though they are paying in to the United States, they may never be able to reap the benefit. Okay, see, how to prove that your income can support your whole family in application of U.S. immigration. So proof of property or work. Proof that they want to see, they'll see bank statements, and it cannot just be one. They want to see multiple months of bank statements carrying a balance. They like to see a deed, sometimes a letter from an employer they'll ask to see. Proof of ownership of other things, property, sometimes international things. It's a lot of on top of, if someone has property internationally, but they have nothing here in the US, that they can show proof of that, but that's a lot of translation often from their home country. And that's another cost added on top of it because you'll need to translate a deed or a bank account from another country just to show that you are worthy of becoming a United States resident.
How does success in another country equal success here? You're coming to a completely another country. You're going to have to reestablish yourself anyway.
Yes, I agree. And many people, though they may be extremely successful in their home country, say they may own a business or they may be a doctor. You can't just come to the United States and do that. That's going to require additional training, or you'll have to re-establish yourself with your business. So it's very difficult. Some of our clients who have bachelor's equivalents in their home country, they'll have their transcripts read. So they'll send it to a company in the United States who will look at their transcripts and determine what their degree in their home country is equivalent to in the US. So that sometimes helps with job prospects when they get here. But usually if someone has a good job history at home and they can prove that, or they are well educated, proof that they've graduated is generally enough, paperwork wise. But it doesn't really, I agree with that sentiment that though you were successful in your home country, it's completely different here. The requirements for jobs are often different here. So it's an on paper requirement, but it may be a lot more difficult when you come to the United States.
I don't know if you already talked about this because I kind of came in late. But what, for example, I know this is going to be really personal to talk about, but my father got deported when I was in my sophomore year, so about 4 years ago. And I don't know what the process is in order to get him back into the country, because now I'm the one that's going to be requesting for him. So I'm not sure what steps I need to take in order to do so, or what I have to do.
Sure. So if you have more questions or anything really personal, we can always schedule a consultation and I can go more into detail with your particular situation. It does depend on why the person was deported. So sometimes people, and I'm not saying this applies to your father, but sometimes people come to the, immigration, they come in immigration's purview because they were pulled over and they don't have a license. Well, obviously you won't have a license if you're undocumented. or it may have been related to a crime. So it's difficult. We would have to assess why exactly he was deported to assess his ability to come back in the United States. But if he does have a deportation, he would unfortunately have to wait 10 years before we could assess any sort of application for him to come back. But we could definitely discuss that further. If you'd like to set up a consultation, I can definitely review your case and give you a little bit more information in a private setting. After this, we'll be sharing our firm information.
All right, sounds good. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm sorry.
Well, I just want to
Okay.
pull up. I'm gonna take moderator's prerogative and pull together a couple of questions that are coming through that have seen a couple of similar questions coming through. So just want to get through them. So one of them, there's actually been a couple here asking about do you have a sense of where we stand relative to other countries in terms of how we approach immigration? So there's a question there, are we an outlier? Do we look different from other countries? Do you have a sense of where we stand in our approach to immigration compared to other countries? And one of the questions said, if you want to one of them was looking specifically at the EU.
Okay. Yes, in some ways we are definitely an outlier. Obviously most countries have some form of immigration law. Some are followed, some are not. I know certain countries, you overstay a tourist visa, Dominican Republic, for example, you overstay a tourist visa, you pay a fee and you can leave and come back in whenever. It's like $100 if you overstay by 30. It goes up by the amount of days. So some countries, they have an immigration law in the books, but you can get around it by paying a small fee and they don't in any other way penalize you. Other countries, I know Australia will allow you to get like a visitor kind of work visa. So you can come in for 1 year. I don't think you need an employer lined up or anything. They are much more welcoming to those who want to come and work for a year. And I know I've had clients who have told me they've done that and then they come through the process in the United States and it is so much harder. So the EU, France, for example, a parent can gain residency just because they have a citizen child, and that citizen can be a minor. So if you have a child born in France that is then becomes a French resident, they have another French citizen parent, you can obtain residency through that child. You don't have to be married to the parent. In the United States, a child cannot sponsor their parent until they are 21 years old. So it's definitely in that way a lot harder in the United States. I think other countries are much more welcoming than we are.
Can I just add something to that? Because I have had friends who have gone to Australia and spent time there, and they're much more picky about who they choose. You do have to have a certain standard. They give you points depending on what your profession is, because they only want certain professions. And she overstayed her welcome by a few days and was told that she couldn't come back for 5 years. So there is stuff in those countries too that are not so great. I know Ireland a few years ago, they did change that policy for the parent-child thing. If you had a child that was born on Irish soil, they no longer could be a citizen if you hadn't lived there yourself for 3 years, to stop people from coming there to have children there and get citizenship.
Yeah.
So there is some other countries that do have some strict stuff going on as well.
Yes. Yes, there are other countries. I know, obviously, it's not like every other country is open borders, especially the EU and that area there. But I do just think in so many ways where the United States has become so exclusive in who will accept and difficult, other countries are a little bit more welcoming. I know people who were unsuccessful in the United States applying for asylum and they decided to move to Canada because it's apparently a bit more welcoming. I can't speak for all of the other countries' laws. I only really am specialized in immigration law. A lot of my knowledge is secondhand from what clients have told me they've gone through in other places they've lived, but I think it's hard to imagine that other places are as exclusive as we are.
Also, a couple of questions have come through on whether or not you can speak to the sort of recent news related to detention centers, and then maybe the more sort of historical place of detention centers as it relates to the holding of immigrants in the United States.
Sure. So yes, there are many, many detention centers in Pennsylvania. There are some family detention centers. There is a large one in York. It's connected to York County Prison. And then there is one that I was just dealing with this morning in Pike County, Pennsylvania. So each state has detention centers that they house immigration detainees in. They are generally separated from the inmates that are in the prisons for other reasons, non-immigration related. If they misbehave, they will sometimes be moved over to the other side. I think it's a little bit of a lower security. But the detention centers, as far as children, it's awful. I dealt with a case last year where my clients were detained down at a Customs and Border Protection barracks near San Diego. And the stories they told me, their young daughter didn't feel good or didn't want to eat dinner, and the Customs Border Protection officers there were just screaming at, 5-year-old girl, you need to eat, you're not getting any other food. They have to drink out of the sinks in the bathroom. They're not always provided with, drinking water whenever they want it, so that's what they have to use. They're very, sometimes inhumane conditions and treated quite awfully, screaming at a 5-year-old. I don't know when that ever became okay, but that seems to be par for the course, and there's no real answering because some of these centers, when someone goes there, it's very hard to communicate with them, especially the Customs and Border Protection. Some of their barracks and detention centers right along the border. It's almost, I would compare it sort of to a black site. I mean, we've had times where clients have gone there and we didn't hear from them for 3 days, and they weren't allowed to call us in certain circumstances. It's somewhat awful, and obviously you raise these with organizations that are looking out for human rights, but you hear about it on the news, but those things do happen and they're pretty awful.
And if I can follow up with that, I'm seeing a bunch of questions kind of come through the chat, and Abby has a great question here on kind of like your sort of cases in your profession which have stuck with you, and I want to get to that. I want to follow up though on the detention and tie in. Ken had written a question. How would you respond to the argument that a lot of these policies started under the Obama administration rather than Trump administration? So I want to roll that into a bigger question about politics and immigration law, and maybe frame it as like, we're on the cusp of an election, and maybe you can just talk about, from your perspective, what do people get right and what do people get wrong about this intersection of immigration law and politics?
Yes. So I think that immigration law and politics are so deeply ingrained, there is no way to separate them. And I think immigration law is one of the areas of law that is most affected by politics. I never expected or never knew when I went into it that by the flip of a presidential dime, my job could just be, so many of my cases could be blown out of the water. You're halfway through a case and now everything has hit pause for a year or more. So that's something that, obviously you're always affected by the courts, but courts generally, there is a process. There are levels you have to go through, there are appeals, and it's a long process. It can go back and forth, but a presidential proclamation, that's overnight. And, sometimes it's the next day or the next week that it's being implemented. So I think that's been the toughest thing as far as politics affecting it. As far as things happening under the Obama administration, as well as the current administration under Trump, I think we're always going to have things happening. I think it's difficult to have the oversight into some of these places. We'd like to, and obviously, ideally, these things should not be happening. Children should not be yelled at. Children should not go missing. People should be allowed to call their attorney if they need to for an interview or something. Kids should not be in cages, families should be together. But I think it's difficult because a lot of these centers, they don't have the oversight. And as I explained earlier, there are so many different governmental entities and agencies at play that it's very hard to monitor all of them and what's going on at any one time. And a lot of these things are happening essentially in the dark. They're not happening out in public. They're happening in a closed detention facility that, unless you're in there experiencing it, or someone who's experienced it firsthand tells you about it, you're not going to know. So I think it's something that obviously needs to be worked on, that goes without saying, but it's something that is difficult. That part of it is difficult to tie to any one presidential agency, how people are being treated in detention centers, because I think a lot of that hinges upon Customs and Border Protection. We sort of call them the cowboys, because a lot of stuff that goes on with Customs and Border Protection and some of these detention centers are, as well as ICE, there's just not a lot of oversight, which definitely needs to change. I think the biggest thing with this administration versus the Obama administration is the Obama administration was still, they were handling illegal immigration. They were making that more difficult. I'd say most governments are going to be tougher on illegal immigration and, prosecuting people for that and putting people in deportation proceedings. But the current administration has really attacked legal immigration and made it more difficult. So those who are trying to, there's no, in my eyes, it's not like there's a right way, a wrong way. I'm just explaining this in the view of the government. Those who are technically under the law, doing it the right way, they are legally immigrating. It has now become so much more difficult for them than it was in the past. And I'd say that's the biggest difference. I mean, it's very unpredictable under this administration. They're attacking the courts. A lot of our judges that we deal with right now are appointed by the current administration. They were former ICE attorneys, so they are all for the government side, when the judge is supposed to be an impartial party. And a lot of them, they're plucked right out of their seats as ICE attorneys, and they're put on the bench. So it's tough to be impartial when obviously your allegiance for many years laid with ICE and laid with the government. That's one big difference, I would say, right now. It's just they're attacking on every front. They're making dealing with the courts more difficult, dealing with the consulates. The pandemic, I feel, has been used as a big excuse to halt immigration. Many of the consulates around the world are still closed. We've seen cases back that should have been completed 6 months ago. People are right at the door to come into the United States. Everything's been approved. They just need their interview. They cannot get an interview. And it doesn't matter. They don't care that they may have a job lined up in the United States, that they may have been, they're away from their spouse or their child in the United States. They are just still stuck, essentially, especially with the proclamation. That, I feel like the current pandemic was used as an excuse to keep a lot of people out. We framed it as a way to save American jobs, but a lot of those people maybe weren't even coming into work. They just wanted to come in and live with their family members, or they weren't taking the sorts of jobs that we're trying to protect. But I do think they are very, very tied. I just think the biggest thing right now is that the former administration went through processes when implementing new rules, and they weren't the types of rules that are being implemented right now that are sort of elitist, exclusionary rules happening once every 2-3 months.
Thank you. We also have a question here from a student asking, what was the immigration case which has stuck with you the most during your career?
Yes. It is that case that I referenced, the family that was stuck in a detention facility near San Diego. They were asylum applicants seeking asylum. They had a very valid, well-documented case for asylum. I honestly think that they would have won. This was very early on in my career. And they were actually, they were an MPP case. So MPP was a Migrant Protections Protocol. And essentially what the United States was doing was people who came to the border to a point where they were caught, crossing the border somewhere thereabouts. They ask for asylum and they say, okay, you will move forward with your asylum case, and they drop them back in Mexico, even though many of these people were not from Mexico. Previously, many people would either be detained at that point and then released so that they could live in the United States for the pendency of their immigration trial. But during this MPP protocol, people were just being plucked up out of the United States and dropped back in Mexico. So they have no resources, they have nowhere to live, no jobs. And for many of the people, they're dropped in Tijuana, they're dropped in border cities that just aren't safe. In this particular case, the clients, they weren't from Mexico. They were dropped there. They moved around because in their first city, they did not feel comfortable. They stuck out like sore thumbs that they were clearly not Mexican. And a lot of the locals were frustrated. You know, they were frustrated because a lot of people were just being dropped back in these cities in Mexico, and they weren't treating those people who were seeking asylum in the United States kindly. They were being targeted. People knew that a lot of these people were coming with all of their life savings. They were coming with everything they had, and they knew that they had no status in Mexico and no one to seek help from. So this particular family, the father was attacked in Mexico. And at that point, if you feel unsafe going back to a country under international treaties, you are supposed to be given an interview and you are supposed to be allowed to stay in the United States if you have fear of being returned to your home country or to the country that the United States plans to return you to. And we actually sent the client to court. He still had an open knife wound on his side. And he lifted it up and showed the judge his wound from where he had been attacked. And he had been attacked because he was not Mexican. The person who attacked him sought him out. They planned to kidnap him because they knew that he had family members, likely in the United States, likely elsewhere, who would pay for his safe release. Luckily, he got away. The family fled, and they came here, and that was, the judge sent them for this interview. The interview happened in a CBP barracks, the same one where their daughter was being treated horribly. And we were not called. They did not have access to their documentation, their proof of what happened to them, including a police report, including photographs of the injury. They were denied a phone call to me to have me on their call. So essentially, when someone asks for asylum, they're given what's called a credible fear interview. And these are generally given by employees of USCIS who are trained to do so. They're trained to recognize if someone's fear is real, if what they're saying is true. Don't ask me what that training is, but they have more training. But the person that was calling them and that they were using at this time was a DHS employee. So not a person trained for this. It was just like a random CBP officer on the phone, not in the room with the family, not looking at the family's faces to see if they truly are in fear, denying them access to their documentation, proving that this happened, proving that the police said they were not safe in Mexico. And they, denying them access to me to try to help the situation. And I did not hear from those clients for 3 days until they called their family members and they were dropped back in Mexico. And I think I cried that night. I mean, I slept for 2-3 nights with my phone on loud next to me, ready to pick up at any hour that they were ready to go. The clients called, they told me, I can't do this. We can't stay in Mexico. We're going to get killed here. We're going to have to withdraw our asylum claim in the US and go elsewhere to some other country. So I think that was the case that stuck with me. It was very frustrating to me because I felt like that was just a complete failure of our immigration system. We're a country that we're so privileged. We have asylum in place. We have processes in place. And we failed those people who really, truly needed protection. And, they had to flee elsewhere and potentially are in danger today. But that one stuck. Yeah. Nate, I think you're still on mute.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Thanks very much for sharing that. I was kind of seeing some of the kind of responses coming through the chat as well. And I wanted to follow up with that, with a question from a student here, which is, the question is, do you think it's possible for immigration proceedings to become easier in the future? It's really upsetting to know how difficult it can be and how expensive it is, and to come here to the US, even legally. So, yeah, I was wondering if you could maybe address that question and kind of think through on your mind, and whether that's from some of the earlier conversation you had around DACA and TPS, which are I mean, these are, there's a reason why they're sort of precarious. So if you can talk a bit about what are, you know, from your perspective, what is the future of immigration look like, and are there ways of you know, ensuring under our current system, are there ways of ensuring that the injustices that you're talking about here are mitigated, or as the student says, is there a way for this to become easier?
Yeah. Short answer, we need a more immigration friendly administration in the White House. That's the only thing I can say. I mean, we've discussed this with current cases that we have that need certain immigration relief that's been taken away in the past few years, that if we get an immigration friendly administration, that could all come back. So something that used to be able to be obtained was called administrative closure. The judges used to be able to close cases if someone was able to seek a form of relief with another agency. So say that someone's put in removal proceedings, they have the ability to adjust their status and become a resident because their spouse is a United States citizen. There's no point in them staying in court, dragging out the resources, fighting against ICE, when in the end, they are going to obtain residency. It's just going to take many, many years. Some of the cases right now in immigration court are taking 5 years. We have, due to the pandemic, many cases have been rescheduled. They're being rescheduled 2-3 years out just for the first court date. So that's something that was taken away during this administration. And I think if we got a more immigration friendly administration in the White House, could come back, and it makes sense from all fronts. You're saving government resources, you're saving people's time. People aren't constantly having to go into court. And I mean, most importantly, if someone is eligible for benefit that they can handle outside of court amicably, why would we send them into court with the risk of being deported when it could much more simply and cheaply be done elsewhere? So go vote.
I think we have time for a couple last questions, and I'm sorry I can't get to all of these, but I'm trying to get to you know, sort of first timer questions here. We have one that came through from Brianna that asks, and this is similar to a kind of putting it into international perspective. Other countries, do they have enforcement like ICE? Do they handle it similarly? Are they more lax? What is the, you know, how do we compare when we talk about sort of immigration, approach to immigration, but how about this kind of enforcement? Do we see something similar?
I know some other countries do have other immigration enforcement agencies. I honestly can't speak to them. I really only practice United States immigration law. So we've just been so focused on our law lately, it's been kind of crazy. I swear some days everything is on fire here. So I haven't had much time to learn about their enforcement elsewhere. I know Mexico does have something they've been enforcing because a lot of those migrants coming up from the Triangle countries, Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, have come through Mexico or stopped on the way. So I know they do have some form of enforcement. I just honestly can't speak to it.
Yeah, I mean, I can, and for those in global studies, this is something that we address. I mean, some of what you're talking about, Molly, resonates with a lot of what I'm seeing. I mean, we think of this sort of question of immigration from a US perspective, but a lot of what I'm hearing has resonances around the world right now. And that question related to ICE, I'm thinking of Frontex, which is like the EU body that enforces border protection for the Schengen area. And they've actually, so that Frontex, they're actually pushing that border out into, actually out into the ocean. And so there's actually kind of proactive border enforcement even before immigrants arrive in the Schengen area. And also doing things like coordinating with foreign countries in the same way that the US is doing a little bit with coordinating with foreign countries to kind of like get foreign countries to agree to kind of like use their border also as the Schengen area border. So it's even preventing migrants from moving through, moving through areas of North Africa or West Africa, in pretty in ways that are very similar to what's going on here. I'm sure if Ania's here, she could probably talk about cases in Hungary, or if we look at the sort of quote unquote migrant crisis in Europe and in Greece. I mean, a lot of what we're talking about here has analogies around the world right now.
I think a lot of people too, they are denied one place and sometimes they go elsewhere. So I know of one particular client, they were denied a certain form of relief in the US and they are currently living in Greece. Like, it's just, there are certain things where certain types of cases are viewed more favorably in other countries than here, but they may be more difficult on another type of case there. There were two things I did want to touch. I saw a question regarding divorce, and I'll be brief with this. If you get divorced, what happens if you get divorced after you get residency, I believe, or if you're married to a United States citizen? There is a process. So if you've been married for more than 2 years, when you become a resident, you get what's called permanent residency. So you could get divorced as soon as you get your green card, essentially, receive your residency, and you're fine if you have that permanent residency. The only time that could come up as a problem is later. You'll have to wait a little bit longer to obtain citizenship. If you are married to a United States citizen, you can apply for citizenship at 3 years. If you are not, it's 5 years. So it changes the timeline a bit. And if they deem that your marriage was indeed fraudulent, you may also be denied citizenship or have your residency removed. But generally, if you get through that initial gauntlet and you've been married for more than 2 years when you become a resident, if you divorce, you're okay. If you've been married for less than 2 years when you're a resident, there is a process. You get what's called conditional residency. And when you've become had your permanent residency for 2 years, you have to file an additional form proving that your marriage, if you're still married, is real again. So it's a very similar process to the first time. They make you reprove it, similar types of evidence. Or if you've divorced, you have to prove that your marriage was real, but it just didn't work out. So it's not like if a marriage fails within its first 2 years, you're just automatically going to be deported and have your residency taken away. You can prove that your marriage was real and something just went wrong, that's not held against you. Similarly, if you've been abused, you don't even need your divorce to obtain that permanent residency after those 2 years. So there are definitely ways to go about it. Just because your marriage didn't work doesn't mean that you will be deported. One thing I did want to mention too, this just happened last Friday. There's been a big case being fought against the State Department. There was a couple, there's a gay couple living abroad. One of them was a United States citizen. One of them was not. They had a surrogate who had their child. The biological parent of the child was not a United States citizen, he was an Israeli citizen. They had twins, I believe. And one of the children was biologically the United States citizen's child. And one of them was biologically the child of the Israeli. The one child was granted citizenship, that who was biologically that of the United States citizen. The other child, the Department of State denied citizenship to, because though legally his father, and for all, we know that's his father, was a United States citizen, biologically, his father was not a United States citizen, and their surrogate was Canadian. So one twin got citizenship, one did not. This has been fought in the courts lately, but the Ninth Circuit just recently ruled against the Department of State and granted that child citizenship, because it is not required that your parent has to be your biological parent to get citizenship. The requirement is that your parents are married at the time of your birth, which these two were. So I think that was a big win for human rights. That's obviously something very concerning that's happening at some of these consulates, is they're discriminating against people because of their sexual identity, or and who they're married to. Had that been a straight couple, there would be no question of that. Even if, say, they may not know, but that may not be the father's child, but they would have never looked twice at it. So I think that's something that's really concerning also that's going on at some of these places, Department of State, some of these countries, is they're treating people differently.
And just Yasmin, if you does that kind of address your question here in the chat as well?
If you're okay, so
sort of.
if you're an American citizen, it is not always harder to get your child citizenship if they're born in another country. So this was a situation that was related to biological child versus non-biological child. I think some of these consulates, especially in other countries, are just really not up to where we are as far as rights in the United States. But if you're a citizen, say you have your child in another country, you are able to get them a consular birth certificate, so report of birth abroad, and they will be a United States citizen, or can be.
So Molly, at the end of every session, we've been asking all the experts and panelists a question that a common question, and we're kind of taking this question and using it as a basis for our wrap-up discussion at the end of the conference. And so the question is this: what can the NCC community, the students, the faculty, the staff, what can our NCC community do to help advance the work that you're doing?
I would say just provide a safe space. That's the biggest thing. I think so many immigrants, they don't feel they have that safe space. If they have a problem, they don't know who to go to. Provide that safe space, provide them with resources, and keep educating yourselves, because that's the biggest thing. I mean, I'll even admit, years ago, before I really was well-versed in immigration law, I didn't know many of these things and how people were affected. I actually went through the immigration process myself with my spouse, so that taught me a lot about it. But I think put yourself in others' shoes, provide that safe space for conversation, and keep educating yourself on what's going on so that you can better serve your students and serve your community, because many things that are happening, people really need support.
And where would you say that those resources ought to come from? So you're providing a safe space, resources, educating yourself. So for students, faculty, or staffers said, yes, that's me. Where should they go first? Where should they go first?
I think a really great resource is the American Immigration Lawyers Association. They have great documents. They are up to date. Something happens, there's a court case, boom, within hours, they've written an article on it. They've shared a resource to educate everyone. Catholic Charities is another great organization that publishes a lot of things. The American Legal Council, I believe it's it might be American Immigration Legal Council, AILC. There are many different organizations who are sort of pro bono organizations or out there to help immigrants. They are generally sharing things. They are posting, little sheets that explain in very simple terms what's going on, what a case decided. So you don't have to read through all 173 pages of a Supreme Court decision. They'll have true facts there. And they often have had immigration attorneys that have assessed what happened and how it will impact people.
Great. Well, thank you very, very much. And apologies, I think I mispronounced your name early on. It's Marte, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Well, thank you very, very much for being with us today. And big, warm thank you from NCC for you being here.
Thank you. I appreciate having me. And if there's anyone that has further questions or they'd like to set up a consultation to look into a case or anything that you've just been really curious about, I'll share our phone number in the chat. I don't know if there's another way to share our information, but my firm that I'm at is called Lehigh Immigration. We are based right in Bethlehem. We're nearby. During the pandemic, we're doing all phone and Zoom consultations, so no need to even come in. We can speak to you wherever you are. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much for a wonderful session. Nate, thank you for moderating. Everybody, thank you for your participation. Feel free to meet in the lobby if you want to keep this, or the lounge, if you want to keep this conversation going. And we're going to take a brief break for 15, until 3:30. And we'll pick up with Action Town activists talking about the local racial justice work that they're doing in Allentown. Thank you, Molly Marte.
Thank you. Nice meeting you all. Thank you for